welcome to our bi-weekly program entitled The Word in a Glimpse, which is broadcast live on Facebook every Monday and every Wednesday at 8 a.m. West Africa time, which is 7 a.m. GMT. Today is the 5th of August 2024, and our topic this morning is entitled The Danger of God's Permissive Will. The Danger of God's Permissive Will. Let's first read the book of Matthew, chapter 19, verses 3 to 9. Matthew, chapter 19, verses 3 to 9. Let's read. The Pharisees also came to him, testing him, and saying to him, Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for just any reason? And he answered and said to them, Have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So then they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no man separate. They said to him, Why then did Moses command to give a certificate of divorce and to put her away? He said to them, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, permitted you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery, and whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery. You see, there are two major kinds of God's will: the perfect will of God and the permissive will of God. The perfect will of God is the divine plan of God for us, the divine plan of God for our lives. It is what God Himself has arranged in advance for us. It's the thought of God for us. While the permissive will of God is just what God permits in our lives. An important point to note is that the fact that God permits something does not mean that it is God's will or that it is God's perfect will. Thus, when God says, for example, that He knows the thoughts that He thinks towards us, which are thoughts of peace and not of evil, this stands for God's perfect will for us. In other words, the perfect will of God is the thoughts that God Himself thinks for us, the thoughts that God Himself thinks towards us, while the permissive will of God is the thoughts that we ourselves think and which we want God to implement in our lives, and God permits the implementation. This is the main difference. The perfect will of God is God's thoughts toward us. The permissive will of God is our thoughts toward us, and which we want God to implement in our lives, and God eventually implements them in our lives. This is it. Now, The scripture of Matthew chapter 19 verses 3 to 9 that we read in the beginning of this teaching gives us a good example of the difference between God's perfect will and God's permissive will. In this scripture, God's perfect will is that husband and wife must be joined together and become one flesh. And when they become one flesh, they become one flesh in such a way that they cannot be separated from one another or from each other. So as to say, there is no place for divorce in a married couple. When man and woman, when husband and wife are joined together. This means that divorce is not part of God's perfect will for us. Yet the Israelites were not satisfied in not divorcing their partners. Especially the Israelite men were not satisfied in not divorcing their wives. Their own thoughts were to divorce their partners whenever they would like to do so, whenever they would want to do so. And certainly that's what they actually did while they were still living in Egypt. Thus, in the wilderness, at the feet of Mount Horeb, God permitted them to divorce. He gave Moses the law that was to be the pillar of the Jewish religion. And among other things which we find in that law, the law stated that when a man wanted to divorce his wife, he had to give her a certificate of divorce and send her away. But this was not the perfect will of God, because as we saw, as we read, as we said, the perfect will of God was that husband and wife were to be joined together in such a way that they could not be separated. And here at Mount Horeb, because of the hardness of their own hearts, God gave them through Moses the permission to divorce. But this was only the permissive will of God. So the perfect will of God is not to divorce, while the permissive will of God permitted them to divorce, especially in the case of adultery. But not only. Now let's read 2 Samuel chapter 8. 2 Samuel chapter 8, verses 4 to 7. Chapter Samuel, 2 Samuel chapter 8, verses 4 to 7. Let's read. David took from him 1,000 chariots, 700 horsemen, no, it's not that one. I'm sorry. It's not. Sorry. Let me check it well. It's 1 Samuel, not 2 Samuel. It's 1 Samuel chapter 8. I think so. 1 Samuel chapter 8. 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 4 to 7. 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 4 to 7. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, Look, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations. But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, Give us a king to judge us. So Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, Heed the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. I think we better read it again so that we will understand very well, even without any explanation. Let's read again 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 4 to 7. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, Look, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations. But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, Give us a king to judge us. So Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, Heed the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected me, but they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. Well, you see, and we first gave a good example of the difference between God's perfect will and God's permissive will, talking of divorce. Now we have another good example of the permissive will of God, still with the Israelites. You see, after their settlement in the land of Canaan, and mainly after Joshua's death, the Israelites were living in the inhabited land, which they renamed Israel, without any king ruling over them. There was no king reigning over Israel. In fact, it was God himself who was reigning over them, and from time to time, whenever it deemed fit, God appointed judges to rule over them, to redirect them as they had to walk. But out of a spirit of comparison, they demanded a king to reign over them, which God did not think for them at all. So they noticed that all the other nations around them had kings reigning over them. Even though these were nations that God has rejected, even though these were nations that God has allowed them to defeat and send away out of Canaan, even though these were pagan nations, nations who were not serving the true God, they wanted to imitate those nations. They wanted to be like those nations. They didn't want again to be different from those nations. So they told Samuel, who was the very last judge in Israel, appoint a king to reign over us. give us a king to reign over us, just as all the other nations around us are. Of course, Samuel was not happy with this idea, because Samuel knew very well that God didn't mean his people of Israel to have a king reigning over them, because God himself was to be their king and they were to be the people of God. This is what God himself said. You are my people and I am your God and your king, in other words. But the people didn't want it. They wanted a king. They wanted to have a human king reigning over them. So being a kingdom with a human king over Israel had never been God's plan for Israel. So having a king reigning over Israel, making of Israel to become an ordinary kingdom, was not God's perfect will, not at all. Yet, because of this demand, because these people were harassing Samuel, they wanted to have a king who would reign over them, and God eventually accepted to appoint a king over them. He was angry, yet he accepted. This is why, this is why he said that in my anger I gave them a king. So in my anger I gave you a king, because God was angry. He was not happy at all with this demand, because this demand was not what he thought for his people of Israel, because this demand was not in line with his perfect will. Yet he accepted to give them a king. He permitted them to have a human king over them. So having a human king over Israel was God's permissive will. And as we see in this example, God's permissive will is most of the times accompanied with God's anger. And this will is permitted in anger, in God's anger. So there is no advantage to have permissive will, God's permissive will in our lives. Dear brethren, we're going to stop here for today, but the teaching is not yet at the end. We will continue with this same teaching on Wednesday, the 7th of August 2024. So meanwhile, God bless you abundantly beyond all your expectations, and have a very, very wonderful and blessed and inspiring week. And please, brethren, please don't seek God's permissive will in your lives. Just abide in God's perfect will. Pray God to make you accept God's perfect will and apply it to your lives. So we're going to end here. We're going to run to end here for this morning. As we said earlier, God bless you abundantly beyond all your expectations.